what you stole.
Hello and welcome to Ricky Attempts to Review Art with such a strong personal and traumatic theme that writing about it with the correct considerate words in mind is perplexingly difficult. Episode 476. I don't mind that that's the case actually, it shouldn't be a smooth road to write about the offspring of anybody else's difficult go-throughs, and I think that being able to empathise with somebody and still have a nuanced take on their art is ultimately more rewarding than slapping a number on somebody else's turbulent experience. I must warn that this review unpacks themes of domestic abuse and suicide, but the album in question does so in a manner that left me gobsmacked. Caligula is an album by screamer-songwriter Kristen Hayter, more known as Lingua Ignota. Clue how to pronounce this name. Her first album, All Bitches Die, caught my ears and then made them into a slow-cooked ear stew. Genuinely one of the most pummeling debuts in recent memory, as Hayter's screeches speak of a real dormant angst that has long been bubbling inside as a result of very real trauma. None of it felt like a laughing matter, and truthfully, looking at this all-caps track list screaming at me by just the simple act of reading it, this new album isn't very funny either. It's actually pretty devastating. All the colour wiped from my face faster than you can say Neoclassical Darkwave. The difference now is that Hayter has access to much more expansive and lavish instrumentation, with real strings and brass leading you through the album like a sinister church service, which makes sense given that Butcher of the World is literally Henry Purcell's infamous funeral march, with her screaming over it. In fact, Purcell seems to pop up all over this thing to say hello, but emphasis on the hell. I think we need to talk about how closely this album's music resembles the chord progressions, melodies, and general religious dichotomy of heaven and hell that Christian liturgical music is so familiar with. And as somebody who grew up hearing a lot of it, this album seemed to connect with me far more, especially as Hayter begins to reveal more and more details and symbolism that speak of her experiences with an abusive relationship and the self-coping that would follow, or lack thereof. It's a seriously harrowing experience, especially as you look into lyrics about flowers, which would normally be a symbol of apology or appreciation, as you gift them to somebody that you care about, except that Hayter has seen this gesture so many times that it's virtually become useless and meaningless, and the true symbolism has inverted and become reminiscent of her experience with abuse. But do you know what other musical style this album is reminiscent of? Black metal, that's right. The way that certain tracks will explode with such storming and thick, unfathomable, smoky textures of screams and guitars, to the point where you cannot tell what the wall of sound is actually made of, but you know for sure that it speaks of sheer misanthropic suffering. The dichotomy of heaven and hell is quite literally demonstrated on this album in every track, and that it is fused so seamlessly gives you an apocalyptic sensation, the end, as in death. And Caligula very explicitly deals with the theme of suicide, but not necessarily as an escape, although it is one way to look at it, but more as a means of regaining autonomy of your body. After feeling not in control of your body or your fate for so long, self-inflicted death comes to mind as the means of regaining this control, which is extremely disturbing but unfortunately the grim reality of how far these experiences can go. And yet, there are constant glimmers of self-realized faith. In the midst of all the visceral and honest anger that you can feel Hayter has, following the abuse she is recounting, you hear a song like Spite Alone Holds Me Aloft, where it's this anguish and bitterness that she channels as energy into persevering to keep herself moving onwards, in spite of the fact that the funeral service occurred half a track listing ago. You can feel dead inside and still determined, but towards the end of Spite Alone, having been absolutely hammered with 2 chords of storming black metal aggression, one of the most chilling moments on the record that I've heard this year happens. This isn't the first time that the album showcases a very vulnerable and tranquil side of Hayter's voice and music. Piano ballads do take place earlier on, and they too are absolutely beautiful, and even provide my favourite moments on Caligula. Oh gosh, every time I say the title I feel like I'm mispronouncing calligraphy. But Spite Alone is the moment on the album where these energies of heaven and hell really begin to fuse, and the transition is so subtle that I genuinely struggle to believe it just happened. But that's the idea. Heaven is supposed to be this place of cleanliness and bliss and peace, and by expelling her demons so extremely, Hayter manages to get at least a little closer to this place. The album itself musically isn't perfect. I'd certainly say that the distorted bass on May Failure Be Your Noose is distracting despite me kinda guessing why it's there, and even the leap that this track takes to its loud explosion was a bit too abrupt. But to me that almost feels like nitpicking because again, I get why it's all here, and I think the way that this album uses that typically ugly and overwhelming characteristics of music production to its thematic advantage is an inventive take on turning rubbish into rockets, matched this year only by Black Dresses and Katie Day, and even those are very distinct. All abrasive aspects of this album are things that typically I would need a lot more adjusting to get used to, but the ways that they manifest on Caligula feel like parts of a bigger portrait, a bigger scene, something far more important to understand and empathize with than I'll ever imagine. Moments on this album sound like the windy unrest before any gigantic windstorm, and boy, does it sound damaging. The impact certainly lingers, and it's not a difficult— oh, for fuck's sake. The impact certainly lingers, and it's not a difficult verdict for me when I say that this earns a strongly saluted 8 out of 10 from me. I know it's coming to the point where my favourites this year are becoming a little bit predictable, but maybe they're just good albums.